All right, I want to give a brief overview of the difference between active and passive voice. You may have had teachers who have already discussed with you before their various advices about using active versus passive voice. That can range from anywhere of, don't ever use passive voice. That comes up occasionally. The teachers will just require you not to use passive voice. I had an instructor recently about like that at university. All the way to teachers who could care less. And the truth is, in professional publications, you see both, and I'll address it a little bit more, some of that debate between using active and passive voice. But to start with, I just want us to be able to identify active versus passive voice in both our writing and in our reading. I'll try not to bog down too much in the details of other grammatical rules and lessons, but some of it will be kind of necessary to better understand the difference between active and passive voice and how to identify them. So as just sort of a brief definition, active voice is what we call it when the subject performs the action of the verb, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. Passive voice, on the other hand, is when the object, which is going to be the action's target, is situated before the verb and the subject then comes after. So let's just start with this simple example right here. Jeremy threw the ball. I always find it helpful to start with identifying the verb. In this case, so we're looking at what is the word that's doing some kind of action or like being something, right? Now, a little bit of a hint in these examples right here, I'm only using what's called action verbs. And so it's not any form of being. It's not a being verb. I'll show you an example of a be verb in a second. But in this case, the verb is going to be threw. This is an action that's being done. Jeremy threw. So once you identify the verb, which is threw, then ask who or what is doing the verb or performing the action of the verb. In this case, it's Jeremy. Jeremy threw. There's your subject and verb. Now, you can have a sentence that just ends like that, right? Subject, verb, complete thought. It could be a complete sentence and stand by itself. So not every sentence has an object, but often there is one. So after identifying the subject and the verb, ask the question, what? So Jeremy threw what? In this case, it's the ball. This is what we call the object, or more specifically, what we call the direct object. Now, if I were to put this into passive voice, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of invert this order. Ball is going to go on the other side of the verb, and Jeremy will sort of change locations with some minor adjustments. So the passive, changing that to passive voice would look something like this. The ball was thrown by Jeremy. In this case, I still have my verb throw. Notice I do have what is called a helping verb in front of it. Okay, so now instead of just threw, it's transformed to was thrown. In this case, the ball gets moved to the front, and Jeremy actually goes within what we call a prepositional phrase, by Jeremy. Prepositional phrase starts with a preposition and it ends with a noun or pronoun, what we call the object of the preposition. I know that's a lot of little kind of grammar language for you, which you may or may not be familiar with some of those concepts, which we've not spent a lot of time identifying parts of speech and parts of sentences like that. But I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an overview of the what's necessary to understand the difference between active and passive voice. Now, we can also use this in this construction right here. I have what's called both a direct object and indirect object. So my verb is bought. Who or what bought? Doug bought. Now, what did Doug buy? Doug did not buy Camilla. No, Doug bought ice cream. So this is my direct object. Just like ball is the direct object in this sentence, in this sentence, ice cream is my direct object. Now, in this case, sometimes you also have an additional object, what we call an indirect object, that goes between the verb and the direct object. So after identifying the subject, verb, and direct object, then I can ask one more question, to whom or for whom. So Doug bought ice cream, to whom or for whom? Camilla. Okay? I just say this to demonstrate that it can be turned into passive voice construction as well. This is when it starts looking kind of awkward, though. So ice cream was bought by Doug for Camilla. It just feels unnecessary. So you can start to see why, though in this case it's not grammatically incorrect, it certainly is awkward. And in good writing, you would want to avoid this. Now, in this next example, Jeremy goes to the park. This looks a little tricky, but notice there is no actual direct object because this is a prepositional phrase, and you won't find a direct object within a prepositional phrase. Now, I have what we call the object of the preposition, sure, but I have no direct object. Okay, and so in this case, you really can't create a passive voice construction. If you did, it would look something like this, and it would be wrong. To the park is gone, Jeremy? No. So we want to avoid that. Next, I want to show you, starting with just the passive construction. Notice that I don't have the true subject of the verb evident in this sentence. Mallory was handed a note. Okay, but Mallory wasn't the one actually performing the action of handing the note. Somebody else was. So I actually have no real subject in the strictest sense in this passive voice construction. And sometimes that's okay. And this is an instance in which the passive voice may be preferred. Okay, so if I were to use the active construction, especially if I don't know who handed Mallory a note, I could, of course, use the pronoun someone, but it still doesn't really identify who handed Mallory a note. It is a more direct way of communicating the action, but I still don't really solve the mystery, if you will, of who is handing Mallory the note. And so in some cases, the passive voice is actually preferred for the sake of, avoiding additional vagaries and ambiguities. I'm just going to say Mallory was handed a note, especially if I'm being intentional about that. If I don't know who it is, or I'm intentionally trying to avoid naming the identity of that person right away. Okay, there could be various reasons why I may do that. A couple additional observations. When identifying the passive voice, note how it always uses a form of be before the main verb, and then I'll say often, because this isn't always true. It is always true that you're going to have a form of be before the verb, and often a prepositional phrase. So if you notice, the ball was thrown by Jeremy. By Jeremy ends up being a prepositional phrase. So subject here is within this prepositional phrase. Same thing with this other construction here. Ice cream was bought by Doug, right? Not always the case, okay, because we have this passive voice here in which the subject isn't in here at all. But, of course, I could say, if I wanted to really copy the active voice over into the passive voice, I could say Mallory was handed a note by someone. And once again, the subject then is in that prepositional phrase. But then note again that you always have this form of be before the main verb, okay? It's not always the easiest for us to identify different forms of be. Unlike other verbs, which more similarly mirror their base form, take the word run, for example, to run. The different forms of run are run, runs, ran, running. They all more or less look and sound like the base form run. Be is weird because look at all these different forms. Am, are, is, was, were, been, being. For the most part, they don't look like the base form, so it often trips us up. But these are different forms of be, and it is helpful to be able to recognize them for different grammatical situations, and in this case, in identifying passive voice, because these are always going to be used as helping verbs before the main verb in the passive construction. Last observation here. Changing the active voice into the passive voice only works with action verbs, okay? Now, if I were to use a form of be as the main verb by itself here, Buddy was our childhood dog, I can't exactly turn this into passive voice. If I did, it would look really awkward. Our childhood dog was being Buddy. Yeah, it doesn't really work, okay? And so just keep in mind that changing the active to passive voice really only works with action verbs. Last note, I want to get back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, in that there's often debate on when passive voice should be used, or if it should be used at all. Like I said, I have had teachers who have flat out banned the use of passive voice. Now, in general, it's not grammatically incorrect to use the passive voice, but essentially my recommendation to you is to default to using active voice unless a situation warrants using the passive voice. Essentially, the reason why we might want to use passive voice is to better emphasize a certain word over another. And so I may be wanting to put emphasis on Mallory as far as talking about Mallory. And so I say Mallory was handed a note rather than saying someone handed Mallory a note. In this case, I'm just going to say Mallory was handed a note. And so generally, we want to think of using the passive voice as an intentional exception to the status quo, the standard, which is going to be active voice. It's more direct, it's more active, it's typically considered stronger writing. But you can't really default to one over the other if you don't really understand when and how you're using it.